Thank you everybody for being here. I appreciate you taking the time out of your morning or afternoon, whatever time zone you are on. Welcome to today's webinar, Embodied Carbon and Interior Building Products, Why Taking the Long View Matters. Quickly to introduce our panelists, we had a quick change here, but we have Mikhail Davis from Interface, Jane Abernathy from Humanscale, and then we also have Jay from DPR. Ryan had a family emergency that he had to tend to, so all of our thoughts are with him, and Jay has graciously stepped in to represent DPR and tell us a little bit about their journey on carbon. So a little bit of background on me and ecomedes. My name is Maya Allman and I head client success for ecomedes. Quick background on what we do. We are a software platform that allows buyers to find the right products for their projects. So we know that green building can be a very difficult world to navigate, and ecomedes is here to help you along the way. So hopefully at the end of this session and this discussion, we'll have some time for some audience Q&A. So as I mentioned, please drop in your questions to either the chat box or the Q&A box. And my teammates on the other side will be sending them to me, and I will hopefully be able to get to all of them. If we run out of time, we don't get to your question, you can always send me a follow-up email and I can kind of relay your message to the panelists if it's for one of them. So with that, we're gonna go ahead and jump right in. Revisiting a CLF study from 2019, we're looking at a little bit of data from that study. We are looking at the impact of furniture, flooring, and finishes, so the tenant improvements, those TIs that you see right there, as well as reoccurring MEPs, mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems. And the graph that we're looking at here, the reason that we decided to share this was because what we see is in the beginning of the project, those reoccurring improvements don't exactly have as significant of an impact on the overall carbon accumulation as the initial construction. You can see with those numbers right there, right? 60 and 90 are much smaller than that 400 number. But as we look over the life cycle of the building and the project, we see that actually that carbon impact starts to accumulate. So by the end of it, by year 45, we see that those impacts have absolutely grown to a significant level. So that is why the theme of this conversation is kind of why taking the long view matters and what role building materials and products are playing in the overall impact of a building when it comes to carbon. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce the panelists in 1 second. So just so we can frame the agenda for today, some of the things that we're going to be talking about are how building manufacturers and builders are addressing embodied carbon. So we have both manufacturers and builders on the call today. It will be an interesting discussion. We get to hear from both sides. What challenges have been overcome or remain on the path to carbon positive building? How costs weigh into the picture and what role that plays. And then finally, what is needed to continue progress on this front. But before we get started, I would really like to conduct a quick poll for the audience to see who everybody is. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and launch the first poll. Let us know if you are a building owner, design, construction, you're a building product manufacturer, or maybe you are just a curious consumer on the call that wants to learn more about the carbon impact of building materials. I believe 2 of the attendees or audience members we have today are also my grandparents. So big shout out to them. Thank you so much for supporting and joining. I appreciate that. I'm going to give about 30 more seconds for the poll, and then we will take a look. Looks like we really got a good representation there. All right. Give everybody just a couple more seconds to answer. Answers are flooding in. Okay, I'm gonna end poll. I'm gonna share the results with everyone. Looks like we got a lot of building product manufacturers that are maybe learning or wanting to learn what some other manufacturers are doing on the front of carbon. We got somebody from the owner side, designers, constructions, and a couple curious consumers out there. So whoever you are, we appreciate you being here today, and hopefully you can get something valuable out of this. Okay, and with that, I am going to go ahead and let the panelists introduce themselves and their organizations, and we can go ahead and go in alphabetical order by last name. So Jane, we'll start with you. Take it away.
Okay. First question is, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Just checking. So my name is Jane Abernethy. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer at Humanscale, and we manufacture products like you see on the screen, like office ergonomic tools that help adapt the workplace to the human body so that we don't have to contort our bodies and slouch and, adapt to screens and technology and put ourselves in awkward body postures, which then can lead to musculoskeletal issues. We've been on a journey for a while trying to see what does sustainability mean to us and what does it mean as a manufacturer. And where we landed was that less bad is not good enough. So we were looking kind of at what was out there in the world of sort of goals, what manufacturers were aiming towards. And at the time, we saw manufacturers were often making goals around, we're going to reduce our negative impacts, we will reduce our energy use by 10%, or we'll reduce our waste by 50%, which are all, very good things to do. It's just that you're still going the wrong direction, just less quickly. So it seemed to us you have to actually account for all of your negative impacts and then go past that and start to, get into the world of cleaning up, regenerating, rejuvenating, and leave the world better off as they're manufacturing. So for a long time, that was kind of a pie in the sky idea, or at least initially we thought of it. It was a visionary idea that we were trying to figure out how to put into practice. We're a pretty action-oriented company, so we're very pragmatic. So we really started with just taking the different steps in a number of different areas. And it plays out for us in our products, our operations, and our company. So there are 7 different pillars where we measure our progress towards being net positive. Climate and energy, climate with energy being the biggest sort of impact towards climate, is one of those across the board. So climate is a very big part of it, but it's also kind of one of the aspects that we look at. And then one of the ways in which we evaluate how we're doing towards, being net positive is through Living Product Challenge. So for anyone who's not heard of Living Product Challenge, it's the first time I've seen a certification where they put the bar at, can you actually do more good than harm? Can you give back more than you're taking? Which aligned philosophically with what we were up to. They had a framework of how to evaluate that for a product, not for the entire company, but for a product. And there are 20 different categories, of which carbon is one. Of course, water is one, energy is one, waste is another one. There's 20 different ways where this is evaluated. So Humanscale did take on the Living Product Challenge. We had the first fully certified living products that met all 20 of the criteria, and looking at giving back more than they take. This is a way of validating, having a third party audit our calculations, our assumptions as to how we think this would work, and check to see that we're on track to make meaningful change. One of the things that's part of Living Product Challenge is the idea of footprints and handprints. So a lot of us might be familiar with the idea of footprints, and we've heard of maybe our carbon footprint or our water footprint or a product's water footprint, or this might have been around for long enough for a lot of us to have heard of that before. Meaning, usually what it means is the amount of negative impact. Often it's the amount for a year, but it could be for, say, a product, for example. There are a lot of different kinds of footprints, and it's a good place to start to understand what is the amount of negative impact we have. We should reduce it as much as possible, definitely. For being part of Living Future Institute and sort of hearing from Greg Norris, who was the chief scientist at Living Future Institute, he teaches life cycle assessment at Harvard and is the director of the SHINE program at MIT. Brought forward this idea that footprints are a great place to start, but a tragic place to stop. Because if all we focus on is just reducing the amount of negative impacts that we have, there are some unintended, you take that philosophy and expand it further, some unintended impacts or unintended conclusions you get to. So if we look at it from footprints, we look at it as though there's a whole pie, we just have to divide it up and try not to take more than our share. But that means that you being in the world is bad for me, and more people being in the world is bad for me, and more businesses in the world are necessarily going to be bad. People coming out of poverty could be seen as bad because they'll be using more resources potentially having access to more, food, which would be possibly seen as a bad thing under the purely footprint model. So he had very nicely come up with this idea, which is rolled into the Living Product Challenge of handprints, where you, instead of just looking at your negative impacts, you would look at your own direct positive impacts, and you can also look beyond yourself. You can look at yourself as an agent of positive change. So you can look at not just the amount of negative and reduce it, but see where can I create good using the exact same calculation methods, ways of measuring, the frameworks where you measure the negative impacts. That same rigor can be applied to the positive impacts, and you can actively try to create more positive impacts. That would be the mirror to those negative impacts, and the name they've been given is handprints. So, it's a matter then of trying to balance the reducing the amount of negative impacts, reducing those footprints, creating more handprints to the point where you have more handprints than footprints, in which case that's the state where you're net positive or the world is better off because of you as an individual or you as a business or as a product. So we've been on that path for a few years now. We've expanded our Living Product Challenge certification, and we now have 25 products that will be Living Product Challenge certified to confirm they actually have a positive impact in water, energy, and climate. So they would be 25 products that are climate positive, which is where we would like to see the world going.
Thank you.
With that, I'll turn it over to Mikhail.
Thanks so much, Jane. Mikhail, let's hear a little bit about Interface's journey.
Great. My name is Mikhail Davis. I am the Director of Technical Sustainability for Interface in the Americas. And Interface, we make flooring all over the world. We're most famous for inventing carpet tile, where we also make LVT and Nora rubber. And the question here, and I frame it as, can your product learn to love carbon? The love carbon is one of the 4 pillars of our company mission. So we make flooring, but I wouldn't work for us if we only made flooring. Interface is famously founded by Ray Anderson, who was a remarkably successful Georgia-based industrialist for the first part of his career. And for his last 17 years, he was a world famous time hero for the planet, TED Talk speaker on how to transform business from a source of environmental negative impact into a source of restorative positive impact. And so when we revamped our mission, which was really focused on reducing our footprint, as Jane was talking about, we're trying to get to have a 0 negative footprint. And in 2016, we really decided we needed to look bigger, to aim for a higher peak. Ray had talked about Mount Sustainability, but I think we discovered that there was an even higher mountain worth trying to figure out how to climb, which was to reverse global warming. We branded that as climate take back. But we took on this mission and just like it was in 1994, when we took on a mission to have what we called Mission Zero, to have 0 negative impact, sounded totally impossible. Which of course, in all of our employee surveys, when we were trying to come up with a new mission, that was the #1 response. It has to sound impossible to be an Interface sustainability mission. We came back to them with, okay, reverse global warming. Does that sound good? Good, sound impossible enough? So obviously we can't do that alone. Part of why we participate in sessions like this, we're trying to really get this party started, get people to reset their expectations on this to where a lot of the conversation on carbon and climate is about, oh gosh, how do we have a future that isn't totally horribly terrible and climate gets wrecked by going over 2 degrees centigrade and then gets even worse and more warming leads to more warming. What if we got our heads around designing a future we actually want? That's what the climate take back is about. And we think it involves at least 4 distinct things we need to do. Very simply, we need to live zero. We need to aggressively pursue reducing our footprint. We need to put less carbon in the atmosphere. We need to love carbon. We need to figure out how to take some of that carbon that we wasted by putting it in the atmosphere where it's absorbing all the heat and bring it down just like a tree would do and make something cool with it. Get back into that relationship with carbon that life has always had. We're all carbon-based life forms. Carbon is our friend. We've just forgotten that because we've been throwing it in the atmosphere where it doesn't belong. So if we look at what the opportunity/challenge is in the built environment, this is what it looks like and this is part of why there's a number of different analyses, and I would encourage you to look at the Architecture 2030 time value of carbon analysis, because there's a component where over time, as the Maya showed, refurbing and, putting all these new materials into buildings does add up over time, over 45 years. But there's also the reality that the shift we have to make is actually in the next 10 years, now closer to 9, between now and 2030, we have to stop increasing and change direction on the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. So that means that the near-term opportunities are the really important ones. So we can say, well, over 60 years of the life of the building, the energy efficiency matters a lot because it uses more energy every year, and that adds up. But those building operation emissions are actually, in the near term, a teeny tiny portion of the emissions from the built environment. And yet it's the tip of the iceberg. It's the part we can see. It's on the power bill. We're very focused on it. It's in the LEED standard. And yet the near-term opportunity is all those emissions from manufacturing supply chains, those embodied emissions, or from a designer perspective, specified emissions that went into just making all the materials that are in the building. Before the lights even go on, there's this huge plume of carbon in the atmosphere from all of those building product manufacturers' supply chains. So what do we do about that? Next slide. So this is, for example, for us, what it looks like. This is how carbon emissions break down in the full life cycle of our product. You can see the big hotspot. Next slide. This is what's traditionally called embodied carbon. It's also called the cradle to gate carbon footprint. So it's from the cradle where the raw materials are born to the gate of the factory. But for most products, this is the vast majority of their footprint. Ours used to be over 80% of our footprint was here. We've reduced our factory and supply chain emissions so much that it's only 57%, still the majority. So this is where we have to focus. Where are raw materials coming from? Final manufacturing, depending on the product, is still usually only 10 to 15%. It's really making all the components, refining raw materials, if it's a mined material, a metal, that's where our hotspots are. And that's how we shrink that iceberg, is we change how we make these raw materials that we're making the products from. This is also good to keep in mind if we're talking about, stay on that one just for a sec. We're talking about carbon neutral, which we will in the Q&A. The first question you want to ask for carbon neutral or carbon positive of what's your scope? Is it the full life cycle? So everything on this, 100% of this slide would be cradle to grave. It's the whole life cycle. This actually even includes 7 years of maintenance and using, vacuuming carpet and using electricity. Or is it cradle to gate, which is what is considered for instance, the footprint in a living product challenge. So the terms are not totally defined. So you do need to, when people are saying, oh, we're carbon neutral, we're carbon positive, make sure we understand what that covers. Next slide. So our path to, because we are in a similar to what Jane said for Humanscale, we don't want to just be less bad. We want to be more good. We want to actually help reverse global warming. So from 1994, when we weren't doing anything, Ray Anderson's bad news epiphany that his whole life's work was kind of destroying the planet. Mission Zero, 2016, we adopt the new mission of climate take back. 2017, we did a prototype just to prove that you could actually have a carpet tile, which is our signature product, that helped reverse global warming. We did a prototype that had a -2 kilogram cradle to gate footprint, prove that it actually could be done. We had to work with a lot of plant-based materials. It wouldn't have worked on the floor. So then the next stage was to take the lessons from that prototype and build them into a commercializable product, into a global supply chain. 2018, we put out a specialty carbon negative backing in Europe. 2019, we bought a bunch of big new machines and scaled up a bunch of supply chains for these bio-based materials. 2020, we launched the world's first carbon negative carpet tile and standard carbon negative backings. So again, incorporating all these lessons from the prototype, but then putting them at scale so they became standard and affordable on all products. Next slide. So this today, if you were to hunt through the EPD data, which fortunately there's tools to help you do that, including ecomedes increasingly, you can see something like this. There is now a huge difference between the worst carpet tile. These are all US made carpet tiles. Anyway, any one of these, each one of these lines is a distinct product platform from a US manufacturer. can either be putting 20 plus kilos of CO2 to get your square meter of carpet tile, or 2 plus. So there's an order of magnitude, 10x difference between the best and the worst. And that has to do with all this innovation we've done in our supply chain to reduce embodied carbon. This is what we really need to see from manufacturers everywhere. Because ultimately where we need to go is not just towards zero to be less bad. This is the less bad chart. We're less bad, yay. Where we really need to go, next slide, is into, now unfortunately the language is so skewed that what Jane's saying is carbon positive, we're saying it's carbon negative, and we need to learn to love carbon. And anyway, our relationship is complicated. So we actually, this was our first, it's a very low pile carpet tile with a juiced up backing that has as much stored carbon in it as possible. But we can actually create a product that actually tips over, let me show the next slide, into being the first carbon negative carpet tile. We are slightly below zero on the cradle to gate footprint. And that really is a marker to say this can be done for a standard non-premium priced, high performance backing and carpet tile. And now our work is to scale up the number of products that we can make carbon negative. Next slide. And then obviously we sell to other product categories that are not as far along as carpet tile on the journey for Nora rubber and for LVT, but we now have some new ideas. We're putting in bio-based materials. Nora already, some of the products already have some natural rubber in them. We're going to see if we can add some more to that. LVT has a lot of the same ingredients we can put in our carpet tile backing. But in the meantime, we'll buy the offsets and offset, make sure everything is carbon neutral across the full life cycle, which I showed you before. Whatever the footprint is, whether it's one of our real durable, higher footprint rubber products or our product that's cradle to gate already carbon negative, we're going to offset the entire cradle to grave carbon footprint with carbon offsets in the meantime. Starts to internalize the price of carbon. We're paying for it, customers not paying for it. It's standard for all products. If we figure out how to reduce the footprint, we pay less for offsets. It's a carbon fee. It's what we need probably the government to be doing. But I'm going to stop there and we'll discuss more.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mikhail. And finally, we are going to hear from the flip side of it. So let's hear from the buyer's perspective. Jay, why don't you tell us a little bit about DPR's carbon journey?
Yeah, Jay Weisberger. I think my sustainability journey started when I made a anti-littering poster in my town in Pennsylvania when I was 5 years old, and it was displayed in City Hall. And since then, in my role as one of the communications leaders with DPR Construction, I also sit with our global sustainability group in the sustainability world most of my construction career. It's been fun watching this evolve, and DPR is a little bit more interesting than I am. So on the next slide, kind of see a little bit about our physical footprint. We try to approach sustainability looking at what we build, but also how we build it. So much when we get into the embodied carbon idea is about the process and not just the end product. One thing we're a big advocate for at DPR is integrated forms of delivery, IPD, design build. We've seen that those delivery methods tend to deliver a higher performing building in general. And when it comes to embodied carbon, a lot of those same philosophies are key to unlocking the value. And yeah, there are more tools than ever before. We try to walk the walk when it comes to sustainability. Some of the numbers, I think we've worked on somewhere north of 300 projects that have gotten some form of certification. Just over the past 5 years, we've had more than $6 billion worth of revenue from green projects. I think that makes us number 14 on ENR's rankings, though it's interesting to rank green contractors by revenue, isn't it? What you're seeing here, though, are 6 of our own offices. We really want to walk the walk when it comes to sustainability. We call these our living labs. We have 6 online and we have more on the way. We just announced a new office space in Raleigh-Durham that is going to raise the bar even higher. But every time we go into a new space, we've been focused on adaptive reuse in all these spaces. Obviously, the greenest building is the one you renovate, not the one you build new. And starting in San Diego, where we hit net zero energy, and looking at different climate zones, looking at different solutions to hit really high bars of either achieving or tracking couple of these offices are still tracking for net zero energy because they're so new. Hitting high levels of LEED, starting to look at pedal certification, incorporating well. And, I want to focus, you look down here at the bottom, the evolution with our Austin office, obviously a very warm climate, but we're able to track toward net zero energy there, the first well building in Austin. And then in Sacramento, which we can take a deeper dive into on our next slide here, taking a really, I think it was a 1940s era, 2 buildings, renovating them both into one facility and actually working with the city to change building codes so that we could use mass timber the way that we wanted to. That ended up sequestering about 55 metric tons of carbon. That's equivalent to taking 33 cars off the road for the year, 14 homes a year, that amount of energy. Doesn't sound like a lot, but that's 55 tons across 28,000 square feet. So 0.02 of a ton per square foot. If you scale that over what we're expecting to add to the built environment by the year 2060, that same space at that rate would sequester 5 billion metric tons of carbon, something like 116 million metric tons a year. Apologies on the math there. No hashtag math, especially if you're on the West Coast like I am. This time of day isn't always great. But really trying to, pivot toward taking that building life cycle view. If you take that integrated form of delivery, looking at everything from your energy use to really looking at carbon as more of a leading indicator opportunity and not simply something to offset after the fact and compensate for that idea of let's not just do less bad by offsetting, but try to do more good by planning ahead. That's the philosophy that we're showing. And I guess the one thing I will note about all of these living labs is very important that we're able to demonstrate that these spaces can be created at or very near current market rates. We understand that there are a lot of pressures out there and everyone's looking at their bottom lines and trying to get every bit of value. We really feel that it's important that we show that these sorts of buildings with the right planning can happen at or near market rate. So we'll get into the Q&A a bit more. Looking forward to discussing.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jay, and all of the panelists for sharing amazing progress and commitment to your carbon journeys. On our part, just a little bit of a glimpse. Ecomedes has also been busy developing a way to integrate carbon into our product. So here is a quick look at a product level filter that we've been thinking about that would enable users to find products that have pulled out the global warming potential out of their documentation. So it would basically take out that global warming potential out of the life cycle analysis or environmental product declaration and allow us to find products that have kind of divulged that on the product detail pages. So here's an example of this kind of display. This is a comparison across 3 different products. So you'd be able to see the difference in 3 products and the kilograms of CO2 equivalent per functional unit. We recognize the need to surface this information in a streamlined way, specifically the global warming potential found within an environmental product declaration or a life cycle analysis, because who really wants to dig through that documentation just to find this one little number that is actually so crucial and important early on in the decision-making process. So meanwhile, we are exploring partnerships as well as other avenues to provide this data across a set of brands in our general catalog and to present it in a way that a building owner or a construction company, a general contractor could use it to make a decision. It's not yet captured at building product categories at scale, except for cement, right? So, we're working on collecting the data from the industry and figuring out how to integrate it into our overall database. In the meantime, brands that have EPDs or life cycle analysis in Ecomedes, please feel free to reach out to us, to contact us about the program that we are running and developing to make your carbon data more accessible. Panelists, we at Ecomedes, through our development work on this filter, have really figured figured out and can attest that working with reported EPD data can be a huge challenge. So I really want to ask you, in terms of the pulse in the building marketplace, what are you hearing around carbon mitigation in general, and how is that influencing the decisions around those products that are going into the buildings? So Mikhail, why don't we start with you?
So fortunately, I would say that this topic of embodied carbon is very hot right now, which is great, because I think it really is one of the big opportunities, both because we've laid the groundwork. LEED has not particularly, focused on embodied carbon, but they did, starting in 2012, start providing a point for teams that collected environmental product declarations from the products that we're using in a building, which of course incented product manufacturers to produce these environmental product declarations. Now, LEED didn't necessarily have a great pathway to do anything with them, to get anybody to read them, which is a hard ask because they're like 10-page technical documents, which is why we need tools like ecomedes and EC3 to pull out the relevant data, the most relevant data being the embodied carbon data. But it's there in the footprint, it's credibly calculated, it's comparable within the product category. So we've laid this groundwork, and now we are finally kind of reaping some of these seeds we sowed with making all those EPDs. And you can use tools to really pull out and include that. So it's exciting right now because people are, one friend of ours at Microsoft who's working on their facilities said this is kind of like the early days of energy efficiency, where your facilities people got super excited because they realized if we turn off the lights in the building when we leave at night, our energy bill goes down by 30%. There's a certain amount of that on embodied carbon where we're just learning how to turn off the lights. Oh, well, I don't need to spec this product, which is, the same price and provides all the same things technically for double the carbon footprint. Wow, I'll just turn off that light. I'll spec the one that's half the carbon footprint. So that's the exciting part right now, I think, is people are just starting to realize that there's some real low-hanging fruit on embodied carbon and building materials, and starting to turn off those easy lights, let alone before we really start to push into innovation and say, okay, well, how can you get to actually storing carbon in your product, or at least carbon neutral with offsets in the meantime? We could have carbon neutral buildings and TIs that include embodied carbon very soon. And we're starting to see some architecture firms set goals to have net zero embodied carbon for all their projects by 2030, which in terms of a science-based target, in terms of what science says we need to do by 2030, is a very appropriate goal to have.
Absolutely. And Jane, what do you think? What are you hearing in the market? What are you hearing in the marketplace right now?
I'm hearing a lot more conversations around carbon, especially over the last couple of years. It seems like that appropriately has become more and more on people's radar. I'm also not yet hearing a absolutely consistent ask, and so I think that is also coming, like some of the ways of approaching it. I think a lot of firms are still figuring that out. One of the things, being in this world of furniture, there's a discussion of how important that is, or how important the original building is compared to the retrofit and the interior. And that's one thing where, we would fall into the interior space or potentially the renovation side of things. And I think it's something that hadn't been on people's radar for a long time, and it's starting to become part of people's conversation, starting to become on people's radar, that it's not just the envelope of the building, it's not just the concrete and the steel, although that's very important, but looking at what's happening when you renovate, because you'll be renovating multiple times. So I'm starting to see this conversation expand past some of our traditional kind of structural engineers and architects, and starting to be including more interior designers and folks who are part of those renovations that are happening, that cycle that happens again and again through the building's life.
And finally, Jay, what are you hearing in the marketplace?
It's interesting, the discussions that I have with my coworkers and with customers, it's a range. As customers continue to address carbon in their own sustainability commitments, we're seeing this conversation advance. I think that, speaking as a communicator, I feel that the carbon discussion, has always been kind of defined around emissions, which to your average person, they see a tailpipe. they don't see a supply chain. So there's still some explanation that has to be done there. But really, I think that we've got models, and our customers, I do think, understand it from, they saw LEED, launch decades ago, almost 30 years ago now. And, that was something that there were some early adopters, but then we built enough knowledge, and then those are table stakes in a lot of markets now. If you were at Living Future last week, I mean, just the things that were discussed at that conference compared to even a decade ago, I mean, seeing how much adoption there have been of some of those strategies, and even how the more progressive certification programs have been adopted by mainstream ones like LEED, it shows that the appetite among customers is there, but it takes getting out in front. I mentioned that idea of how do we get these discussions to happen at the, when the project is at its conception, when before the designers have really started to put their ideas down literally onto paper. What discussions can we have to make sure that the space is going to align with the customer's sustainability goals, design that will lower the footprint out of the box so that we're not playing catch up with offsets? And I guess a quick thing with offset is, I think we're hearing a lot of discussions about, oh, how do we offset? And I think everybody wants, oh, well, if we'll plant this, that'll take care of that. We can't plant trees to get out of this problem solely. We have to look at more holistic approaches. And I guess the other thing is, not every offset is created equally. Personal story, I try to offset my travel every year. I've used the gold standard for that. And, it's funny, a carbon offset that you can actually track and get the data on and get certified on, it's not cheap. So, making sure people understand that, paying their way out of this, wouldn't you rather do a little bit, maybe a fraction of that on the front end in terms of design, thinking about your materials, thinking about the life cycle of the building. So it's, if we don't need to renovate something quite as often, that can help you. Let's not put carbon on top of carbon. Let's think about the life cycle of the building and what elements. Let's get that carbon in there once and make that value scale over the life cycle. So those are the kind of discussions we're happening. We hear a lot of talk about this idea of how do we get regenerative. We need to provide the roadmap from folks from a very early stage to get.
So we're having the right kinds of conversations. We just haven't gotten to that kind of rinse and repeat cycle yet. Well, hopefully we will get there. We will get there shortly. And in the spirit of making the conversations around carbon more accessible, I do want to just explain really quickly. I know Mikhail briefly touched on this in his presentation, but when we say climate positive or carbon positive, those terms aren't standardized yet. It means the same thing as carbon negative. And what that means is the products and processes that are happening are basically taking out more CO2 from the atmosphere than they are putting in. And that is typically achieved through the purchasing of offsets, as Jay mentioned. So how do we figure out how to, transition from just putting our money where our mouth is and purchasing offsets into creating products that are actually going to, in the first place, use less carbon? So that leads us to our next question of what are some of the major challenges around this? How do we achieve this? How do we achieve a reduced carbon footprint? And how, once you've done that, how do you deliver that and make that accessible to your customers? So Jane, why don't we start with you on this one?
In measuring and achieving, first of all, yes, okay. Yeah, so one of the challenges we have is that we're a global company that manufactures a lot of different kinds of products. We have a global supply chain, and we have factories in a few different places around the world. And so although we do the raw manufacturing of some of our components, there are also a lot of components that can be 4 or 5 levels, 6 levels deep into the supply chain, possibly more. And so when we look at the scope of all of the impacts, our scope 1 and 2, so that would be our own factories and our own emissions, direct emissions, and then electricity use. That can account for maybe around 2% of our total amount of emissions. The supply chain is around 97%, maybe, we'll say around 95 to 97%. So it's really a lot in the supply chain. And we have a varying amount of influence over our suppliers as well, because we have many, many different suppliers. We have good very close relationships with some of our suppliers where we have literally taught them how to calculate the carbon emissions, worked with them to set emissions reduction goals, and those represent maybe 40% of our inventory spend. But then there are a lot of suppliers, when we look at everything that we purchase, we might purchase screws from a supplier, and it's a very specific screw, and we buy a handful of boxes a year because it's for a product that doesn't sell as often, or a component that doesn't sell as often. And that supplier is definitely not going to jump up and learn how to calculate carbon emissions on our request, because we're just not spending enough with them. So we really have this range of what we can achieve in our supply chain. And then we also have a variety, quite a number of different suppliers, it being global, and then in different types of industries that we're in. So we have like buying raw chemicals from, say, like a large company like BASF, through like using metals and electronics components that have very different kind of supply chain, where you're looking at multiple layers deep, and some other complexities that are other concerns in those supply chains as well. So in measuring, we do a mix of using primary data when we can, and then we end up using lifecycle assessments, for when we can't, for a lot of the different components that we can't use the primary data. The other thing we found kind of interesting is being at that, trying to have that conversation around having what I've been calling climate positive. Again, as you mentioned, the terms are not official, or there's, I don't know if there's an agency that's tried to make them official yet, but that's one of the challenges, is being at that forefront and trying to push the status quo. Then not all the ducks are in a row and not everything's in place. And even like, what are the wording to use to communicate this can be confusing. How does it show up on an EPD, or in the EC3 tool, or how does it show up in different ways that systems that are communicating this information? To have that perspective, it isn't always set up to show that aim to have a positive impact. And then, as you mentioned too, there may be a considered difference between the inherent positive impact that a product like, say, wood could have by actually directly sequestering that carbon, but then you might have where you're doing offsets, and the net amount might be the same. The ways of communicating that is all kind of not very well defined at the moment. So that's where we try very hard to be very clear on what we're claiming and what's actually being communicated, at the same time as we need it to be simple enough that it doesn't lose people before we've communicated what we're trying to say. So there's a variety, of course, of how much people already know, and knowing what audience they're communicating to, and trying to communicate accurately while it's not all standardized, I find is also a challenge.
So various ways to measure, trying all of them, doing it no matter how you have to get there, and creating accessible terms and great communication so that customers can understand exactly what they're getting. Mikhail, what about you? What are some challenges that interface and you personally are having?
I think when you're measuring this, the good news is that we have a much more mature life cycle assessment discipline than we ever had when we first started using it back in 2000. Now, every major university teaches life cycle assessment, and there's a whole, huge technical life cycle assessment conferences every year. It's still a modeling science, and the challenge for manufacturers, I think, is to get more real data and less model data. So when I say model data, you say, okay, well, we use this much nylon in a carpet tile, and it's produced in North America from this percentage recycled content. There are generic data sets that are from a nylon manufacturer in North America. It's not your nylon manufacturer unless you go to your supplier and say, we need you to give us your data, and to do, ideally an EPD, a full life cycle assessment, and then gets reported in an EPD. So we've actually done that with a lot of our tier 1 suppliers. And the cool thing is that once you have their actual data, then you can have conversations around, oh, wow, you have this really cool recycling facility, but it's on a coal-fired power grid. Now we're into the weeds and the specificity that allows us to actually work with them to find solutions, which in that case we did. We got them switched over to renewable energy for that facility, which results in their footprint goes down, our footprint goes down. But the cool thing, and this is part of how we send ripples through industry, is that that facility serves a lot of other people besides just interface for carpet fiber. That same facility is providing nylon fiber to Adidas and Prada and Gucci and Athleta and a lot of our competitors who buy from this same supplier. So this is the exciting part about digging in and starting to get beyond these generic data sets, is once we have the actual data set from our supplier, we can talk about real solutions. You know, we've worked with suppliers that are far bigger companies than we are and managed to help them address some of their hotspots in their carbon footprint, which of course reduces our footprint, but it also reduces the footprint for every other customer they have, most of which are much larger, customers than us. Thinking about, Owens Corning, our fiberglass, partner, has made a huge investment in renewable energy to power their electric arc furnaces, which, turn sand into glass. But that, of course, in turn lowers the footprint of all the fiberglass they produce in those facilities, not just the tiny little piece of fiberglass cloth that Interface buys for carpet tile. So this is the exciting part of it, is when we start to really pull these levers on carbon footprint and have the discussions with our suppliers, we create these huge ripples that lower the carbon intensity of our whole economy.
Absolutely. Okay, and Jay, quickly, what are some challenges that DPR is having?
Plug for ecomedes. I think that tools like ecomedes, we've got really good data on the materials themselves out there right now, which is great. I think the Declare program was where that really kind of started, and enough work has been done on the materials side, though it needs to continue, obviously, but we've got a good baseline to be able to track good embodied carbon when it comes to the materials themselves. The transportation of those materials, the energy that was used, how that was produced, it gets a little fuzzier in there. Mm-hmm. What I guess one thing I would say to that is an industry, when we build things to within 1/32 of an inch tolerance, we're not an industry that is wired to not let perfect be the enemy of good. But when it comes to these sorts of data measurements, sometimes you're like, well, it's a little fuzzy. Like, we can do more good with a bit of error in there in the data. In terms of delivering it to customers, though, the feedback we always get is data needs to be operationalized. We need to make this easy to achieve on every project, so it's not rebuilding the wheel every time. So there just needs to continue to be more information sharing. There needs to be more transparency. The more that we're able to capture data, make those best guess estimates on the things that are a little fuzzier and roll with that. And honestly, the certification platforms give us a good starting point. I think it's just making sure we're being transparent and trying to account for as much as we can so it can be that operational data.
Absolutely. Well, it sounds like common denominator here, right? Better tracking and bringing it in earlier in the process is potentially going to be a solution to that. But at least none of you put a huge emphasis on cost. Quickly, I wanted to share a study that we did with a few interns from Lehigh University and Notre Dame. We pulled together a bit of rough global warming potential to price performance data to kind of explore the myth, is sustainability really more expensive? And I just wanted to quickly share a slide with the audience to kind of show what we found. So we had 4 of these interns analyze just a few hundred EPDs. And as we can see from this sample of ceiling tiles, one of the biggest findings from the study, apart from the realization that there are so many different kinds of drywall, was that there is potentially a positive correlation between carbon and price, where we might expect to see a negative correlation. While as price goes up, so does the amount of global warming potential in a product. So we know that this was a very elementary study. We did not take into account a lot of the raw materials or the differences and nuances between products, such as soundproofing, those types of things that may also cause a product's GWP level to increase. But it was an interesting takeaway to say the least. So panelists, as we bring this towards the end of our conversation, you have all devoted many years. I think we were talking earlier, we were definitely accumulated at over 50 plus years within all 3 of you and your sustainability journeys. So moving on to our final and last question. And let's, try to keep this to really one piece of advice. I want to leave a few minutes for Q&A at the end, but if you had to give one piece of advice for someone that is wanting to become engaged in the carbon challenge, what would you tell them? Jay, why don't we start with you?
Try to be quick. That planning side of it, and Natalie, I see your question in the Q&A. The more we can do to encourage people to think about stuff before shovels ever hit the ground, when you're just thinking about building it. Don't think of it as an offset. Don't think about how you're going to handle things once they're in place. You asked about what kind of policy. We just built a whole bunch of brand new neighborhoods and cities around the country in the last building boom. And to my knowledge, none of them are all using district solutions. Think about how we can get away from the per building way of viewing this and into the district level, because when we work together, we can really move a big needle, and that takes planning.
Absolutely. And Mikhail, what's your one piece of advice?
That's a good question. I think we have to have a combination of seeing the big picture and investing in real substantial innovation that gets us to the place where we can store carbon in buildings, where we go beyond just reducing embodied carbon to actually starting to get to net zero embodied carbon, ideally without offsets, but in the short term, probably with offsets. But we start to have more and more materials where the supply chain has been re-engineered to actually store carbon in the product and in the supply chain, so that we actually turn our longest living human monuments, our buildings, into places to store some of this excess atmospheric carbon that is threatening the stability of the climate. That said, we need to have our eye on that big goal of buildings that actually cool the climate and turn off all the lights in the meantime. We need to take the stuff that's on the shelf, cost competitive today, do all the simple stuff, not get lost in the weeds, not try to take it all on at once, so that we do our first building project where we try to do embodied carbon and we say, oh my goodness, that was so hard, I'm never going to do that again. Start by scaling the basic stuff, but with an eye toward the future of the big vision and the goal. We have tools better than ever, improving every day. I put the EC3 tool in the chat if people haven't played with that. Use them for what they're good for today and continue to push toward where we actually want to be, the future that we actually want to design together.
Absolutely. Okay, Jane, your last but not least, what is your one piece of advice?
I guess since Mikhail and Jay have already said the good pieces of advice that I would consider saying, which I totally agree with, I think I'm going to take it somewhere else and say that one of the challenges I find is, all of us in this conversation are on the journey to accelerate, using less carbon, leaving less carbon in the atmosphere, using it in our products and our buildings. I think probably our next challenge to take on is having more productive conversations with those outside of this room and outside of this group. So that's kind of where we need to go next, is to realize, we need more people to join us, and we're all going to be living in the future together one way or another. So let's plan for that and start to work, larger way, more together.
Absolutely. Yeah, we were talking earlier, right? We now have less people interested in becoming lawyers and doctors, and there's a lot of students now studying environmental science. So that's why I got into it. That's why I studied it, and hopefully we'll keep seeing that growth. Okay, quickly, I'm gonna do some multitasking here. I'm gonna launch a poll to see what the audience thinks, just because I think we're all curious. And while that poll is launching, I have a lot of questions that just got flooded in, and we have about 5 minutes. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna ask one question that I think is a great question, and I want maybe one or two of you to take a stab at it from an owner's perspective, right? So the people that are paying for these development projects, how do we make this happen? Do we make these types of platforms where you have to use this to find a sustainable product? Do you make it required? Do you make these types of products required? What if they're new into the sustainability journey as well? How do they influence the sustainability of a project? Anybody want to take a stab?
Sure. I think we hear from designers and builders will say over and over again that they're here to support the customers. I mean, if the customer asks for something, they're going to get it. And I think it's taking a hard look at, those overall sustainability commitments and asking like, well, wait a minute, what's the role that this facility is going to play in this? And how can we make a difference there? And who are the people we can go to that can really help guide us in a way that we're not going to, spend $1 zillion on this, but something that, we can afford. So I think it's, when it gets prioritized, it gets done. And, one piece of feedback I remember hearing from a developer, I won't say from where, but it was involving regulation. And this developer was like, we've been in business a long time and we've always made money. You set the rules where you want them, we'll figure out how to make money. We need to be a little bit more brave when it comes to not being able to stand up for the things that we think are right and just showing those pathways to making it a win for everybody.
Absolutely. I think that's a great piece of advice, and I think that's a great place to end the discussion and the conversation. Really quickly, I wanted to share some of the results of what the audience thinks. Clearly there's a consensus, right? We need some more frameworks on how to operationalize on this data that is entering and flooding the marketplace, and we probably need more data, right? So it's great to hear that the audience, has an opinion about this, and hopefully the leaders on this call can put their heads together and figure out how to make it happen. So I promise you that if you asked a question in the chat box, we will try to get to them and relay them to the panelists. You can also go ahead and send me an email if you want to share your ideas with me around how you think we're gonna solve the carbon crisis. Please send me an email at maya@ecomedes.com. If you want to learn more about the platform, we have a free platform to use, products.ecomedes.com. You can go ahead and check it out. You can also check out the custom platforms that we have made for the 3 panelists here at DPR, Interface, and Humanscale.ecomedes.com. You go ahead and check out their super sustainable products and read a little bit about DPR's process on their platform. And I want to thank the panelists so much for being here today and sharing your insight and your wisdom behind your own journey. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and thank you everybody that was able to attend. We will be in contact, and we will be sharing a recording of this, so don't worry if you were not able to make it, or if you have a friend that you want to share it with, feel free to forward it along. That email will be coming out, I believe, maybe by the end of the day or tomorrow. So thank you.